So the first thing I have to say is please turn off your phones, very easy to forget. And then I wanted to start by saying to Isabella, I mean, interesting about the sort of pioneering side, because of course that's what's happened with what Isabella and Charlie have been doing, is that they have become pioneers in wilding. The term might have been coined in the 1980s, but it really didn't take hold until we all heard about NEP and what they were doing. But at the beginning, probably even now, they weren't universally popular with the audiences of the other farmers, for example, who really felt that we should be continuing to industrialize our landscape. And I thought what was really amusing and interesting, I think in the film this came out, we'll talk about the film, is that Charlie said that he went to a farmers' meeting of local farmers in the area of where they have their castle at Knepp, and you'll hear a bit more about that. And what happened was that he told the farmers all about what he was doing, and at the end of his little speech, there was just stony silence. They didn't really like what they heard. So tell us a little bit about that, Isabella.
Yeah, I mean, we do really remember that meeting because, you know, we assumed that, and we're on, you know, terrible Sussex heavy clay, which is the reason we stopped farming in the beginning. And, you know, we sit on 320 meters of this stuff, so it's unfathomable. And we're really marginal land for people who, you know, who know the farming talk. We're sort of grade 3, grade 4. And so we just weren't making a profit. And we assumed that when we'd found this wonderful get-out clause, that we could actually do something for nature and be paid to do it. So be paid to restore our soils, be paid to get nature back. Finding all these extra income streams like ecotourism and things that were actually going to make our estate viable as a business for the first time in probably 50 or 60 years, that other farmers around us would want to join in. And so when we had this meeting where we invited neighbours to come and listen to our plans, Charlie had drawn up this fantastic map. We're 3,500 acres, and he'd drawn up a map of a notional 10,000 acres, including our neighbours, you know, boundaried by big roads and rivers, a kind of natural block that could be an amazing project. And I think we just assumed, I mean, we're in our 20s, I suppose quite arrogantly, that they would want to join in, and none of them did. You know, they were sort of horrified. So we realised there was this huge gulf between kind of, you know, what we saw as a great opportunity and an exciting thing to do, and then a kind of cultural fixation, as it were. I have got some images, which maybe might be an idea to show now, just to show kind of what, you know, the before and after, which kind of gives you an idea of where we were coming from and why our neighbouring farmers were so horrified.
Just before you click the button, I just thought it might be interesting for people here just to show how many people have actually been to Knepp. So quite a lot of the audience, but clearly not everybody. So, you know, one assumes that people know the story, but they don't necessarily. So we're going to start with a little film that...
so this is hopefully a before and after. So you can sort of see... what you have to do, I'll play it again actually. Oh, it'll come back, that's right. You have to look at that oak tree in the back because it's quite difficult otherwise to keep your bearings. That's what we were when we were farming, and this is what it is now. So this is what horrified our neighbours, quite understandably actually, if you think about it. And that's what we were, and why we were horrified eventually by what we've been doing to the land. And I think what this makes us realise is that, you know, that what was quite shocking is that if farming had been productive for us, if it had been turning a profit, we would never have turned into that scrubland. We probably would still be farming like that today. But now we realise what damage we as farmers were doing to the land without thinking. I think if anybody had asked us, we would have said that we were kind of stewards of the land, that we weren't doing anything wrong by nature. And it's only now, having been on this journey, that we realise what massive impact we'd had on the ecosystem. This just demonstrates kind of what we're now doing. And this was because our project was really influenced by a man called Franz Vera, who really demonstrated that free-roaming herbivores are drivers of ecosystems. So if you want to get biodiversity back in a depleted, polluted ecosystem like our farmland was, you introduce these amazing animals. So red deer, fallow deer, we've got Exmoor ponies, we've got pigs being a proxy for wild boar, we've got Exmoor ponies being proxies for the tarpan, the original horse, and Old English longhorn being a proxy for the aurochs, the ancient ox that we also hunted to extinction. So having these animals as drivers of the system creates a really interesting mosaic of habitats that is just rocket fuel for wildlife. They're the sort of the key ingredient that kind of helps the glider to get back into the sky to fly again, if you like. And they all contribute, their disturbances contribute in different ways to the habitat. So the way they, and beavers, of course, another herbivore. So we've now got 6, basically, drivers of the system. So they're all ecosystem engineers. The way their dung rekindles life in the soil, the way they disturb the vegetation, the way they move plants around the landscape, the seeds in their hooves, their gut and their fur, they all have massive impacts on the environment. You can see how they graze and browse those thorny scrub, amazing sort of topiary shapes that come. We think they're quite outlandish, but actually that's probably what these scrub is supposed to look like, because it co-evolved with these big mouths, these big influencers. And of course that compact, browsed vegetation is perfect habitat, perfect cover for nesting small mammals, for nightingales and other songbirds to keep free of predation. So that's just an idea, and you can see the amazing amount of songbirds we have, and insect life. So that's one thing I think we're very aware of now when we think of biodiversity. It's one thing to tick the species off, which is very satisfying and exciting, but it's also the abundance of species, the abundance of life that's there, that is really important. So we're now bucking the trend in terms of, we've probably got one of the densest populations of songbirds in Britain now that have just found us because habitat is back.
And name some of the particular ones, because I think when I went down there, we saw, we heard a turtle dove and a cuckoo. You know, how many people have heard a cuckoo recently? It's something that was very common in our childhood.
So we've got cuckoos that are based on sort of dunnocks and also on reed warblers. You know, they're putting their eggs in both those species' nests. So we've got lots of cuckoos, but we've probably got one of the densest populations of nightingales. I think we had 50 singing males last year, which is huge for our area. And we've also, got one of the last populations of turtle doves that is actually rising in Britain. This is a species that's likely to go extinct in the next 10 to 15 years, according to the RSPB from Britain. When I was a child in the 1960s, we had 250,000 pairs of turtle doves, and they're now just down to a few thousand. So it's quite likely that Knepp will be the last place. I don't think we can turn the clock back. Knepp alone can't do it, but we're probably the last place you'll hear a turtle dove. This is just a kind of idea of now what it was.
So, of course, one of the things that the farmers were very annoyed about was the weeds and the things, particularly something like ragwort and things. So tell us a bit about that, and something about your thistles coming and going, and so tell us a bit about these rogue species that people hate.
We had lots of ideas of what might derail this project in the beginning. We had lots of yours sincerely disgusted letters from neighbours, from people who were very against the whole idea of rewilding. We assumed it was going to be something to do with the large animals, this sort of fear of coming across an Old English longhorn on the footpath or something. But actually, it was the so-called injurious weeds. It was ragwort and creeping thistle that almost derailed us, because in the early days, of course, you've got that ploughed farmland and you just let it go. You leave it after its last harvest, and you get those pioneer species coming in. And we're it's so ingrained in us to hate ragwort and thistles that to most people that was the biggest affront of all. We had one person even writing poems about ragwort to our local newspaper. In the book Wilding, I thought I could get away with a couple of paragraphs about ragwort, but I soon realised it took a whole chapter just to explain why it is demonised wrongly, and it really shouldn't be. It's
and
bad
also,
science.
one of the things that people don't understand is that you can have cows and horses and anything else in a field with ragwort, and they're fine. It's only a problem if it gets into hay.
Precisely. They don't recognise it when it's dry, but they won't touch it if it's living. I mean, unless they're in a paddock where they're desperate for food or something, or a trace element, and then they might try and eat it. But that's bad husbandry.
I've got a lot of pictures of cows in ragwort just to illustrate that point.
I mean, it's called things like Stinking Willie and Mare's Fart for a good reason. It just does stink. But
it's also the host to hundreds of species. I think 200 species of insect love ragwort, like the cinnabar moth and all sorts of other things. So.
I mean, so this is a weird thing. It's a myth that won't lie down, and there's so many myths like that. We have King Charles, who's president, I don't know if he still is, of Plant Life, urging Plant Life to get rid of ragwort in its nature reserves. And you're thinking, but this is one of the greatest hosts for insects, as you say, that we have. So it's a kind of thing that we have conditioned in us. But I think one of the things that very nearly derailed the project was creeping thistle. And I just described that in Wilding, in the book, because that's a clonal plant, and it kind of comes in. Again, it's a fantastic host for many, many species, but it's a clonal plant, so it comes in and can take over acres and acres within seconds. And this was taking over by the year, tens and tens of acres. And particularly of the old Repton Park. So it was an eyesore, and people were really beginning to get shirty about it. And Charlie was beginning, after about 3 years, he was thinking, oh my God, we're just going to have to make an exception here and get the toppers out and put on the herbicide, because, we can't risk the whole project just because of this one species of wildflower. I'm trying not to use the word weed ever again. And then this miraculous thing happened where painted lady butterflies, every 10 or 12 years, they migrate here every year from Morocco, but every 10 or 12 years there's a boom cycle, and they come over in literally tens of millions. And we woke up one summer's morning to see these butterflies passing our window like tracer, and wondered what on earth was happening. And we rushed outside, and they were landing in clouds on the creeping thistle, and that is their food plant for their caterpillars. So they were laying all their eggs on the plants and then sugaring off, and the eggs hatched, and the larvae ate the plants, and they were just these kind of standing tatters of stems left. And the next year there was no creeping thistle. And so that was our first real lesson in sitting back and letting nature get on with it, to accept the boom and bust cycles of nature. And what had happened in the meantime with this amazing clonal system of thistles, it had protected the ground from the hooves of the animals, and so we had these anthills, growing very, very fast. And then that became also cover for common lizards, not so common anymore, but that's where they were breeding, in the thistle. So there was a boom cycle for them too in that year. So everything has a knock-on effect if you can just sit back and let it happen.
Actually, one of the things you say in the book, which I really love, it says encouraging people not minding so much about the presence of more benign and non-invasive weeds is perhaps an even happier approach. But I think it's so lovely, because actually seeing that in that context is, we simply look at it, and just think a whole lot of thistles or nettles or docks or whatever. But actually you've been able to step back and see the bigger picture. I think that's really...
And that's true at landscape scale, and if you have these drivers in the system that can get rid of the stuff for you. So, the ponies will munch on thistles, the pigs love thistle roots, so they'll go in and dig them up. Docks, they'll go out of their way to rootle up a dock. So, in nature, if you've got a fully functioning ecosystem, those pioneer species actually won't be so conspicuous.
And also, one of the things that struck me when I went to Knepp was that you come down the drive and there's masses of brambles everywhere. And I thought, brambles everywhere, the things. And then, of course, as I went round, I picked up the things that the bramble is the mother of the oak. So it's sort of like, it's another example of it. So
absolutely. And so, we think of, at the moment, we're really fixated on spades in the ground to get trees back into our landscape. And it's probably the worst thing we can do. We've got to think of natural regeneration as the default mechanism for getting trees back. When we think of planting trees, we're mostly fixated by carbon storage, but we never take into account the carbon cost of those trees. So they're usually propagated in nurseries. That's hugely carbon intensive. You've got to transport the saplings to site, then you plant them in polypropylene tubes, attach them to a tannalized wooden stake and a plastic tie, and then you're probably glyphosating the whole area to spray off the competition once, maybe twice. Then those plastic tubes don't rot down, and maybe if they did rot down, it'd be even worse. And what you end up with is a monoculture plantation. You may have put a few more species in there, but they're all the same age. So it's a very poor habitat for wildlife. At the end of the day, there's probably only 3 birds, I think, in Britain that feed and breed exclusively in closed canopy woodland. I was actually
going to start off this talk saying, well, it's ironic because you're called Isabella Tree, but actually there's a slight negativity about our obsession with tree planting and carbon offsets, and recognizing that this, like many other environmental issues, is a much more complicated debate than...
Much more complicated. And I think one of the important things that we never talk about when we think of spades in the ground is the genetic diversity of the trees themselves. If you're buying them from a commercial nursery, for example, they could possibly be clones. They're certainly going to come from a very restricted seed source. If you're allowing trees to naturally regenerate using thorny scrub as protection, which also provides them perfect microclimate for them and gives them kind of mycorrhizal connections as they grow, so they're going to have genetic resilience and immunity from the start. But you're also getting genetically broad spectrum of plant. So I don't know if you've ever seen those amazing images, satellite images of pollen plumes coming over from Europe, from the Apennines, that are spreading over Britain. Our oak trees are being pollinated all the time by pollen from the Apennines. So they are going to be producing offspring. Every acorn on an oak tree has a different genetic code. Some of those acorns will be pollinated from Italy, and they will have... be able to grow into trees that are naturally resilient to climate change. So they've got the answer already if we can just allow these wild trees to establish. And that's why also our ash trees have, the wild ash trees have about 20% resilience to the disease. So the ash tree won't be gone forever, but if we allow the ones that remain to diversify and grow and spread through natural regeneration, that's going to be the safest.
And the other thing you say about trees, which is one of the things, is that we have an obsession with tidying it up when they've died and taking them away. And I just thought you might expand on that, because it's clearly not what you advise.
Yes, I mean, dead trees are fantastic habitat. You think, the millions of years we've had dead trees standing in the landscape on the planet, and all the species that have learnt how to build nests in them, to drill for insects in them, the saprophilic beetles that specialize in the wood of an oak tree that is 3 centimeters at the branch, that is 3 inches in diameter. I mean, they're so specialist, and then we're just cutting down these trees as soon as they're dead
And burning
them often. Yes, exactly. But that was us. When we started the project, there was a tree that died in front of our eyes just shortly after we'd embarked on rewilding, and we'd agreed that we wouldn't do any intervention. But we kept having this discussion, well, it's right in our eye line, maybe just that one we can... Charlie was itching to get at the chainsaw. And in the end, we just let it die and watched it. And it probably had died because it was in a pocket of, at the bottom of a slope where for decades and decades, the nitrates and the agricultural chemicals had just been, concentrating in that corner. And it had finally overwhelmed it. But we watched this tree die gracefully, and we watched the short-tailed voles populate the root system. We saw woodpeckers and a sparrowhawk made its nest in that tree. It became perfect perching for the herons. It suddenly, evolved into this amazing life of itself, not to mention all the lichens and the fungi. And of course, this is where bees nest. So one thing, we're missing in our landscape is hollow trees that are big enough for wild bees to nest in. That's why they come into our roofs and our attics. They can't find that space out there in nature. But having stopped cutting down trees, it's amazing how many there are in the landscape just after 20 years. They're absolutely everywhere. They would have been a really important habitat in the past. So if you've got ash dieback, wherever you can, where it's not going to be a danger to property or a footpath or anything, try and keep that tree standing, because that will be colonized very quickly by all sorts of amazing species.
Now, one of the things that probably drives you mad, certainly does me to some extent, is that I am continually challenged about the conflict between wilding and food production. So I wonder if you could just expand about that and say why it's not such a bad thing.
Well, I mean, the whole question of food security it's a massive, complicated issue. And before I start, there's someone who's just written a fantastic book about this called Henry Dimbleby's Ravenous. Is amazing. Yes, and it's very, very clear. He was commissioned by the government to do a food strategy report. And the government hasn't taken him up on a single of his recommendations. As he points out in the back of the book, he lists the recommendations, and they all make absolute sense. Not a single thing has been done. But essentially, one of the elephants in the room when we talk about food production that is never addressed seriously enough is food waste. So currently, we're producing enough food globally for 10 to 11 billion people. This is a UN report, so it's, it depends which report you read, but essentially between 10 to 11 billion people are being, that we produce food that could feed that number. And we're 8 billion at the moment. It's something like, apparently, I read last week, it's the land mass of China could be completely over to food production that is wasted. That is wasted. It's 30 to 40% of food fit for human consumption is just either thrown in the bin, scraped off our plates, or it doesn't get to the supermarkets or the distribution points where it can be sold. Or even fed to the chickens. Or even fed to the chickens or the pigs, exactly. And there was a very interesting report actually done by Tim Benyon the other day saying that if people in Western Europe dropped their meat consumption by just 15%, so not a huge amount, so not eating meat, say, for a day and a half a week or something, if my maths is right, that would negate any need to import grain from Russia and Ukraine together. So that's a really big food security issue. We've got to change our meat consumption. We've got to stop industrial meat production. That's unethical. So actually, I wanted to, last year, George Monbiot came and spoke here with his book, Regenesis. Yes. And of course, he's advocating no meat at all. And he effectively said that people like you and I assume that you're in the same camp, less meat, better meat, yes, were almost the worst of all because of the larger land area about it. However, obviously, in your book of wilding, clearly livestock are an absolutely integral part of wilding. So I wonder if you just talk about that. I've never understood this. George is a friend. Yes. And I've had this conversation with him many a time. And I still can't understand why he doesn't get it. Yes. Well, he probably says the same about me. But I think, flora and fauna have co-evolved. We've seen how amazing these large herbivores are for habitat restoration, for soil restoration, for everything else, for seed distribution, for their part in getting trees back in a landscape. And we just... I think his shout about NEP is that, and he's very kind about NEP, and I think he loves NEP, but he says it's not going to be any good for supplying meat for people, and that's absolutely true. We are not in the business of producing food at NEP. We're in the business of producing nature and all the other ecosystem services that come with it, like soil restoration and flood mitigation and air purification and all the rest. Well, there is a little bit of
food, isn't it? Because
There is
you
a
do
little
sell
bit,
your
but that's a
pigs
kind of
and-
like a byproduct.
Yeah, it's a byproduct.
But regenerative agriculture, on the other hand, I think is about the primary purpose is food production with nature as a byproduct.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, the flip side and how they kind of shadow each other. But even in regenerative agriculture, livestock can play a really important part of the sort of the cycle of soil restoration on a farm. So George is wanting to cut them out of that picture altogether, and I can't understand why.
Well, I wanted to ask him exactly that question when he came here, but I never got the opportunities. You know, what about animal manure in terms of growing crops in regenerative?
Absolutely, and we don't know enough yet, but the gut bacteria of an animal is actually stimulating bacteria in the soil. So without that, we are missing a huge amount of soil function. But we're also missing all the dung beetles, all the things that live in the shit that have co-evolved with dung. We're missing, animal carcasses in the landscape. There's a huge, it's a life cycle, and a cycle of death as well. So if we don't mimic that in our farming systems, we are missing a really big part of the picture.
Actually, one of your things, I think, is the story of the dung beetle and obviously the pivotal role that they play, and the fact that most farmers nowadays put their animals inside in the winter, and then the poor old dung beetle doesn't have anything to eat in the winter.
Yeah.
So I sort of wonder we should be sort of putting up a sign, save the dung beetles.
So massive die-offs of dung beetle in the winter. And that we had this amazing master student who came to NEP, and she, on an organic farm next to us, in one day, I think it was like a 2-hour survey. She collected 500 dung beetles on the organic farm and nearly 12,000 at NEP. She was horrified because her system involves killing the dung beetles. She'd never killed so many beetles in her life.
Yes.
But we weren't worried because we know we've got plenty more where they came from. But it just shows that because we have our animals out all year round, as nature intended, those dung beetles are proliferating. And so what will happen on the organic farm next to us when they let their animals out in the spring, our dung beetles will just be piling into them.
Yeah.
So that's just one way, I think, that rewilding works hand in glove with regenerative agriculture. I'm sort of assuming that we all move into regenerative agriculture because we know that we're going to run out of soil, topsoil. If we don't do that, we can't cope with the pollution anymore. We're going to run out of water resources. We know for all the reasons that make sense, we have to shift to no-plough regenerative farming. And that is beginning to happen quickly, actually. Very exciting.
Although the government perhaps are not encouraging it as fast as
it's
they
almost
might.
happening despite
the government. And I noticed in the book there was some quite interesting things that the government are imposing that actually are sort of in conflict with what you're doing, such as tagging the calves when you might not actually be able to find where the calves are. And I also was quite interested in your idea about leaving dead animals for the predators. So I thought you might expand on that.
Yes, I think it is a real sort of anchor, it's a brake, if you like, on rewilding and other places that want to create rewilding projects, including nature reserves that want to go a bit wilder and have these animals in the system, is that they are still governed by domesticated livestock regulations. So we have to tag our calves within 5 days, I think it is, of birth. And sometimes it's very difficult to find them. And why should cows actually even be tagged in a system like that? The pigs don't have to be, the horses don't have to be. So, could we get a dispensation for that? We're Soil Association Organic, and our pigs, under Soil Association regulation, should be checked twice a day. This is obviously for a farming system where you're wanting to make sure that the pigs haven't turned their trough over, that they've got access to clean water and to food. But in a landscape like that, where they're just happy as Larry and finding everything they need, you shouldn't have to do that. But, sometimes it can take days to find the pigs, to be honest. But, so far we've got away with it. But this is a really, really serious question. If we want to remain organic and sell our meat as organic, we have to have a dispensation that allows free-roaming animals to be regulated in a different way.
And there's also something about the weight of the animals as well. You had to get to a certain weight in a certain number of days that just wasn't possible.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of things. I mean, the Old English Longhorn, for example, are a rare breed. So we can get money for establishing a herd. But in order to be registered on the pedigree books, they need to reach a certain weight by a certain age, which essentially they can't do on a natural diet. They have to be grain-fed or fed proteins to build them up to that level. That's a kind of nonsense, I think.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of discrepancies that I hope when rewilding becomes much more mainstream, as it is now, and certainly Rewilding Europe, the organisation in Europe, are pushing for as well, that we can be allowed to do and be much more relaxed about, including, as you say, carcasses in the landscape. Because if they're not near a watercourse, there's no reason why on organic soil that is functioning, it's got all your dung beetles, it's got everything else that's eating your necrophagus insects.
Yes.
That carcass will disappear within days. And hugely important to get the calcium and all the essential minerals from those bones back into the soil. If you think of our farming systems at the moment, we're endlessly taking animals off. They're eating, taking off. So our soils are depleting of all those minerals.
Extractive industry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the birds need the calcium for their eggs. We need to get, because we have basically the flushing loo systems that we have now, we don't get night soil, as it used to be called, back onto the land. So all those minerals are being lost. And carcasses are one way we can keep some of it back on the land.
So obviously we've been focusing on NEP in particular and what you've done there because that gives the context. But in the book of Wilding, you're also talking about some of the other issues, and in particular, not all animals are good in all situations. So, for example, sheep farming in the Highlands, and I actually have talked to a number of people about that, and there's all sorts of controversy about it. But in the book, you say that the sheep farmers are given a huge subsidy by the government as sort of an average, and then they make a loss on what they're doing, and the sheep are very destructive. So I thought you might just explain about that.
Yeah, so we haven't included sheep in our rewilding project because sheep really are a very late introduction into our ecosystem. So our world, our landscape, has co-evolved with these animals, or at least these animals' ancestors. So the plants have evolved to cope with those particular mouthpieces, their particular vegetation preferences, their particular disturbances, their hooves. And sheep come from Mesopotamia. And so, with their tiny little hooves, they're actually used to evolve to be running on rocks, and their mouthpiece, is designed to be pulling out herbs and grasses in a very rocky landscape. So put them onto our soft hills, and it's like releasing tens of thousands of people in stilettos at Glastonbury. I mean, they're literally compacting and destroying the soil function, and they're being very indiscriminate about what they're eating, and so. They're probably the wrong type of animal for a rewilding project. Having said that, it is all about numbers. So it's numbers of animals in a given area for a given amount of time. On chalk downland, chalk grassland, for example, sheep are a fantastic conservation tool. They're put on and taken off, and you can have fantastic wildflower meadows up on those chalk grasslands. So I think they can still work for conservation grazing. But we just have to, at the moment, the farming systems using the number of head of sheep that we have, particularly in the uplands and in Scotland, is hugely destructive. It's not to say that we couldn't still have sheep and have that cultural landscape, but let's take the numbers right down, allow the vegetation to recover, perhaps go back to a baseline that's pre-Victorian, when there were many more cattle and ponies up on the hill and many fewer sheep.
And that's what Ben Goldsmith, for example, is recommending, isn't it?
Exactly. So. And still have your lovely herdwicks and your cultural value, but recognise that it's a kind of numbers game, and how is the ecosystem functioning? Let's get that back. As a priority. Okay, so go the other end of the spectrum is that a lot of people are thinking about what can they do, and obviously they have much smaller plots of land. So we've got 9 acres and we've turned it over to Wilding to give people an example of sort of what they can do in their own gardens and things. And of course the Book of Wilding covers that too, and I found it absolutely fascinating all the way through. But obviously that section was really fascinating. And you said
that essentially the bigger the wilding project, almost the easier it is in some ways, because when you have a smaller one, you can't necessarily do the animals and let them do it. You've got to sort of replicate them. So
Exactly.
tell us a bit about what you think about
Exactly. So I think the Book of Wilding was really, it was a sort of lockdown project for Charlie and me, because we were getting so many emails and letters and, gosh, I mean, songs and poems and paintings and things from people who'd been to Nep and been inspired by seeing how nature bounces back if you let it. And that story of hope was kind of galvanizing people to think, can I do it too? Can I do something on the patch of land I have, whether it's an orchard or a cemetery or a churchyard or your own backyard in your own back garden? Even a window box. We had several emails asking, can you rewild a window box? And we thought, yes, of course you can. Mm-hmm. And so the premise really behind the Book of Wilding is that rewilding is on a spectrum. So at the wildest end of it, you've got Alaska, Yellowstone National Park, Chernobyl exclusion zone. You've got huge wilderness areas where people are largely remote from the system, where you've got apex predators. The whole thing is functioning without human intervention. The smaller you get, so say you get to Nep at 3,500 acres, we haven't got apex predators, so our main intervention is controlling the numbers of the free-roaming animals we have. If you get even smaller, to say 100 acres, you may not even be able to have free-roaming animals, certainly not all year round. Mm-hmm. So you may have to do more interventions. Perhaps you put animals in for the summer, if you've got a friendly farmer who would like to run his cows on your land for a bit and take them out after a couple of months. We even had a farmer who was thinking of doing a business called the Flying Pig, where he would actually donate pigs to rewilding projects and then take them out again. But the smaller you get, and the more difficult it is to have these free-roaming animals in the system, you have to become the free-roaming animal. You become the keystone species. So you think like a beaver and a wild boar and a water buffalo and start performing like those animals. So coppicing, for example, is what are you doing? You're going in and being that animal, browsing on those trees. If you're creating a pond, you might, instead of just creating a sort of, and you can do this in your garden. So, a nature-friendly gardener might put in a pond, but it might be, quite an ornamental pond with a sort of equal edges around it, similar depth the whole way through. You'd think, well, what would a pond be like in the wider landscape? It would have different levels. Maybe half of it would even dry out in the summer. Mm-hmm. Perfect habitat for loads of species that love ephemeral ponds. But then you'd think like a beaver, and you'd throw in some dead wood. You'd allow that to break down, so there's algae that would feed the aquatic insects, that would feed the small fry, the fish. You'd create kind of perhaps networks of branches that would also create cover, so that those insects and small fry could escape predation. You'd think like a water buffalo. We used to have a indigenous European water buffalo that we hunted to extinction. So you'd become that extinct creature, and you'd puddle around the edges of your pond, creating pockets for your aquatic plants to come in, for the toads and the frogs to spawn in.
So all just so much less manicured and more
much
organic.
Messier, and allowing natural processes to happen, not worrying if your water levels in your pond go up and down, if it gets muddy one area and not the next. But thinking about nature at the forefront, how do those processes that I can observe in the larger landscape, in wild nature, how can I replicate them in the garden? So just thinking about when you're pruning your rose bush, for example, with your secateurs, what you're actually being is the nipping teeth of a pony or a deer. Mm-hmm. And the bush, in response, has evolved over millions of years to recognize it's under attack. It bifurcates, it throws out thorns, and it also throws out flowers that we love. And it also prolongs its lifespan, sometimes by double its lifespan, because of that effect. There's even a study done to show that if you anoint the bits of branch where you've cut your rose bush with your secateurs with herbivore spit. So if you're in a position to be able to catch the spit of your pet pony or something and anoint that onto the bush, the enzymes in that saliva are read by the bush, and it will throw out even more flowers and get even denser.
So actually, picking up on flowers, I'm going to ask this last question, and then we're going to get on to questions. I've been told, obviously we started a bit late, so I'm going to start the questions in a few minutes and not worry a little bit about overrunning. So one of the things I thought was quite interesting is that, as far as I'm aware, you don't have a sort of wildflower patch per se at Knepp. And obviously one of the advantages of smaller gardens like mine, where you don't have the animals grazing, is that you can create these areas which are the wildflowers needing the poor soil and create those sort of patches and things.
Yeah.
So, in a way that's in sort of juxtaposition with the two things. But I know that at Knepp that you have also started wilding your own garden, but that started a lot later than the rest of the estate. So I thought, let's hear a bit about your garden.
Yes, I mean, we were sitting there in lockdown, at the beginning of lockdown, and we sort of, suddenly looked at our garden and thought, oh my God, what have we not done? We'd been looking so much at the wider landscape for 20 years, and we'd forgotten about our garden, and the glaringly obvious thing to us was Charlie's manicure croquet lawn, which was kind of, it was played on probably 3 times. I know Chris Wilmot-Sitwell's in the audience, and he's going to, he thinks it's an abomination that what we've done to the croquet lawn. We have a croquet tournament every year.
It's now a month, isn't it? Yes.
So what we did was we with the help of Tom Stewart-Smith, and this is all described in the book, because it might provide ideas if you really want to do something radical with your garden. But Tom Stewart-Smith, who's an amazing garden designer, and James Hitchmo, who specialises in brownfield sites and doing amazing things with gardens in inner cities. We dumped 400 tons of crushed brick and concrete onto the croquet lawn. And it's amazing. It's created this incredible sort of lumps and humps and bumps. And so there's, it's really mimicking the uneven surface of land in nature. We forget that we've combed most of our land with ploughs for millennia. But naturally, you'd have all these hollows where water tends to sit, where you have, even on a molehill, you have different plants on the northern side, on the cold side, to the southern side, the sunny side. So you're creating all these sort of microclimates around your garden. Plus, you've got 3D, so you've got a much larger surface area to plant. And you can have fun with it. We're not being purist about our native species. We've planted over 900 different species of plants from South Africa, Australia, the Mediterranean. So they're all kind of xeric plants. So this is a garden designed not to be watered, to have no fertilizer. But they're also all plants, mostly wildflowers, that are very hospitable to our insects in Britain. So we hope that we've prolonged the pollinating season. One of the problems our bees and all our early insects are finding is enough wildflowers in the landscape when they come out of hibernation. So you can have early flowering plants that come from all over the world and late flowering plants. I mean, there's more private gardens. The surface area of private gardens in England is greater than the land under nature reserves. So they can be a really, really important way of bringing back wildlife, supporting wildlife. And if you consider yourself as a keystone species, going pesticide-free and being perhaps a bit messier and more experimental in your garden, you can do some amazing things for wildlife.
So, if you want to know more about it, obviously read the Book of Wilding and the previous book, which was just called Wilding, which is the story of how it started. The Book of Wilding is more about like a manual. But also, there's a fabulous film called Wilding that has been produced. I've actually been to the premiere, and there are more premieres coming along. However, it hasn't been launched or distributed yet, and we don't yet know when it'll come out, but it is really brilliant. So we're just having to cross our fingers that it is distributed at some stage soon.
Yes, I hope so. Yes, it's looking for a home at the moment, but it's going to be at the Brighton Film Festival and at Aldeburgh Film Festival. And then a couple of festivals in the States, and hopefully it'll find someone to pick it up.
Yeah, and it's got some amazing things like pigs diving for mussels in the waterways. I mean, and the photography was beautiful.
Yeah,
so
beautiful.
yeah, I really thought it was completely brilliant. Okay, so lights up, and we're going to do some questions. What I would say is that when we finish the questions, don't all get up and rush, because Isabella has got to go over to do book signing at the back, and she's not going to be able to get there if you all get up. So stay put, let her run off. Also, when you're asking the questions, keep it short and snappy. Make sure it is a question. Isabella's going to keep it short as well, because we want to get in as many questions as we can, and we're going to go for at least 10 minutes. Okay? So here we go. First person down here. Okay, so somebody's got the microphone, and then the person in the middle there afterwards. Okay? You can start since you've got the microphone.
Yes. At the risk of provoking disaffection, and as a morning listener to the farming programme, could somebody please comment, could you please comment on the attitude of government into manoeuvring or moving in your direction, please? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think if you'd asked me, a year or 2 years ago, I would have been hugely optimistic. And I think, the passing of the Environment Act was an amazing thing to do. The direction of the Environmental Land Management Scheme that's replacing, the old CAP farm subsidies was going completely in the right direction. I have no idea what this government is doing, rolling back on all that mileage we've made, advances for nature. So it's deeply depressing, but let's hope we have a change soon.
Yes. Okay, gentleman here.
So we have about 60 million acres. About
60
million acres in Great Britain.
Oh, okay.
Just
quite a large land holding.
60 million acres in Great Britain, which roughly 60% is in some form of agriculture. You are Minister of Food now, and you're Minister of Wilding. How would you run Great Britain?
I would continue producing food from the best soils, from grade 1, grade 2 land. I'd shift to regenerative agriculture everywhere, which we know is possible and we know is sustainable. There's lots of wonderful books about this. Gabe Brown, Dirt to Soil, Growing a Revolution, Henry Dimbleby's Ravenous. I would have rewilding essentially as the webbing that is supporting that food production. So it is allowing your water tables to restore, it is providing the pollinating insects for crops, it's providing the natural pest control, the dung beetles, it's providing physical buffers against storms, against wind blow for your food production. Your land will become much more permeable anyway to wildlife if you shift to regenerative agriculture, but rewilding will be the place where biodiversity can actually really rocket again. And so I see it as working hand in hand with farming. We need to do both. And that is the way I think we're going to get living landscapes back again that will actually give everyone access to nature, which is we know what we need for so many reasons.
And also something we were talking about before we came on is that there's a huge issue about our diets and obviously food waste, which we mentioned, but are basically about changing our diet. So we can't just keep going and thinking that we've got to provide enough food for what we're currently eating. We have to actually change what we're eating because it's so appalling, really. What's
and
going
Henry
on.
Dimbleby is brilliant. Sorry to keep promoting someone else's book, but it is totally brilliant. Because
maybe
what
he'll
he's
come.
saying is, it's an issue of social justice. Actually, we talk about cheap food, but if that cheap food is hyper processed, then it's actually trapping people in a cycle of ill health, and we have to change that system. Yeah.
So we've got to move that on. I mean, if you go anywhere, sort of a children's theme park or whatever else, the food is absolutely appalling, and there's just so much that needs to change. So it's not just production; it's also what we're eating. Gentleman here.
Hi. Picking up on the environmental land management schemes, would you like to see more direction from DEFRA on resolving the debate between land sparing and land sharing?
Yes, I mean, this is the land sharing, land sparing debate is, should we essentially spare more land for nature by intensifying agriculture in areas where we are producing food? What I've never understood about the land sparing, land sharing debate, when people are talking about doing more intensive agriculture with, chemical, industrialized ploughing and everything else, is that is not sustainable. So no one who I've ever heard talk about this ever talks about the soil, the topsoil, and how that is disappearing. You know, we've just been to the Fens in Cambridge, and there's some places in Cambridge where they reckon there's only 15 or 20 harvests left. So, you know, we have to think of sustainable systems of agriculture. And I don't think it's a question of either or. We can have both. It is land sharing. You know, we can have nature on agricultural land. We know that if you, even with conventional farming, if you spare the land around the sides of your field, so you have crop margins where you've got pollinating insects, you've got wildflowers, you've got, you know, soil restoration, it increases the yield of your crops. So you're not actually losing anything by actually giving more land to nature on agricultural land. So I think we've got to look at rewilding, nature restoration, and farming as integral. They work together.
And you're also talking about the margins on the side of the road, for example, how much the council would save by doing it.
Totally. Why is the council spending money on mowing our verges to within an inch of their life, turning them into kind of, you know, billiard tables, when we croquet lawns, when we should, when we could be having lovely wildflower meadows, you know, along our roads that become green corridors, and spend the money on free school meals or something else, or looking after the elderly. It just seems nuts.
Okay.
Hello. So I work in a sector called regenerative finance. And you mentioned at the very beginning that actually new financial models was one of the things that allowed you to initially make this shift. And I'm just wondering, how do you think finance currently needs to evolve to better support projects like this all over the globe?
Well, I think it's a really exciting time, and you'll be more aware of this than anyone. It's incredibly exciting. I mean, forget governments, because, you know, their will turns on a sixpence, and they're probably never anyway going to have the resources, the money to spend on nature restoration of the scale that we need and as quickly as we need it to make a difference to the planet. But what is coming along instead is private finance. So all those companies that are now desperate they've got their accounts that are now visible by law. So their shareholders, their employees, their board members, everyone can visibly see their carbon footprint and their impact on the environment. So they are having to spend money on either carbon credits, biodiversity credits, or just doing the right thing and doing something that their company is going to be proud of, and that is nature restoration. I think last year in Europe, something like 580 billion euros were spent on the voluntary carbon market. And now, if we can move into biodiversity credits, which is something Charlie is involved in with an amazing company called Replanet, we can actually measure biodiversity in tradable credit system now. So, you know, that is likely to shift into projects like Rewilding that can do carbon storage and biodiversity. I've just got one thing I've forgotten to, which is really breaking news and very exciting about NEP, is that, you know, for ages people have thought, well, rewilding is fantastic for biodiversity, but it doesn't do anything for climate change. And I've never understood that, because if you're restoring your soils and your vegetation, surely you're storing carbon. But the government spent about 100,000 quid earlier this year on a project to drill down with a company called Agricarbon to take core samples from our rewilding project. About 1,000 core samples going down 1.5 meters deep, so deep, and 4 samples from each core. So it was a really big data set. And what they found was that we were storing more carbon in the rewilding project in the soil at NEP than a newly planted, a 25-year-old plantation. So that is really exciting. We now know that rewilding does carbon and biodiversity, which is a game changer, I think.
Fantastic. That is absolutely brilliant. Yeah, really good. So we're going to try and get someone further back. Yes, here there's a couple of hands there. So if you could bring the microphone to... Oh, there's some people up there as well. Oh, okay. Right. So have you got the microphone with anyone up there? Yeah, okay, so 1 up there, and there are 2 down here, and there's probably another person up there. Okay, then we'll do 4.
Whilst you're rewilding, you're also responsible for governing the numbers of livestock at NEP. I'd be interested to know what your stocking density is, and whether you change it to reflect natural fluctuations in, wildebeest on the savannah.
Yeah, so if you're familiar with stocking density, I can't kind of go into the what it, but it's we are 0.27 of a livestock unit, which is much lower even than conservation grazing, and far lower than agriculture. How we see that is it's basically an animal welfare issue. So we look at the body conditioning score at the end of the winter. And so we're looking for animals that are looking fit at the end of the longest, harshest winter and the latest spring. And that's pretty much the level at which we want to keep the animals. It works for biodiversity. So not surprisingly, perhaps, because they're finding plenty of scrub to forage in the winter. And so that's the stocking density we work on. There have been moments how we did it. We built the herds up very slowly, and when we felt we'd reached a point where actually there was less food for them than we wanted during the winter, then we brought them back down again. But we didn't react to a kind of particularly harsh winter. We waited 3 years just to see that the trend was going in the wrong way, and then pulled back the numbers. So it's judging it by eye. It is an artificial system, and we're very conscious that we're not affecting the ecosystem in the same way as an apex predator would. But it works pretty much. So we know. And in the book we do talk about stocking densities for different types of soil. It's a complicated story.
Next one over there. Have you got someone there?
Yes, I wonder, with your system, how you would manage an increased right to roam. West Dorset has, I think, the largest number of footpaths in the country, and most farmers have to grapple with this already. But presumably you have an external fence somewhere.
To keep people out.
How do you see your system matching up with people roaming everywhere?
Also, that dogs aren't very popular with Isabella. Dog walkers.
Well, I think irresponsible dog walkers. There's
Yes.
lots of fantastic dog walkers, but there are quite a few who do, allow their dogs to nose around, all over the place. And I think this is a really, really interesting question, and it's a fine line. I mean, we feel passionate that we need more access to nature for people. We've got to, we know for our own mental and physical health, we know that urban populations need nature. We're going to win or lose the battle for climate change and biodiversity loss in cities, because that's where most people live. So we've got to engage urban populations with the countryside and with nature. So they've got to be able to access it easily and freely, and preferably not have to get into a car to get to it. But equally, we need areas where wildlife has a chance to recover without continued disturbance from people and dogs and cats. So we have friends in the kind of nature restoration movement who are really keen on right to roam. And we would say that at NEP that would be a disaster for us, because we would have disturbance in all the areas where we're beginning to see ground nesting birds coming back, and just allowing spaces for our free roaming animals to behave naturally. So we feel that better footpaths, maybe permissive paths. At NEP we've got 16 miles of public footpaths that are open 365 days of the year, but we've created 4 miles of permissive footpaths, so you can do circular routes walking routes around the estate. So I think until we have more nature back in our countryside, we definitely need more space for nature. We can't yet release ourselves as a species onto it kind of willy-nilly, or we will actually end up destroying what we're trying to preserve.
Is there one more question over there? Yep, and I think that's it, unless there's somebody on that top bit that's been dying to... Okay, we'll do the person over there, and then there's this person here, and then that'll be it, then we'll go off for the book signing.
So thank you very much. It's been a fascinating talk. When you started this project, you said that the estate was losing money. And so my question is the estate now profitable? And if it is, what are the principal income streams? And then as a sort of side question of that, and I know we're not allowed to ask very long questions, but are you employing more, the same, or less people than you were when it was a traditional farm?
I mean, this is hugely important because I think, you know, people often look at rewilding as being sort of like, you know, a sort of whim or kind of like a sort of, you know, wishy-washy sort of, you know, idea. But it's actually about establishing effective businesses and getting actually kickstarting rural economies, I think. And we're seeing this across the whole of Europe, where they're doing rewilding. You're actually restoring people to, you know, villages that have been abandoned for centuries. So at NEP, when we were farming, we employed 23 people. We now employ 70 full-time equivalents. So far more than we did when we were farming. Our main income streams now are ecotourism. So we have a small glamping, camping and safari business, really small, but that turns over about 1.2 million a year, and we get a 20% margin on that, which is way higher than we could ever have expected from agriculture. We had a -1 or +1% margin when we were farming. All those buildings that were just, you know, part of the farming infrastructure are now being converted into office space, light industrial use, storage, and the companies that rent the buildings from us employ 200 people. So that's 200 more people back into the sort of rural economy, as it were. And then we've got our meat production. So we sell 75 tons of live weight meat a year, which we sell direct to the consumer on our website, and now in our son's cafe and restaurant, which is now another income stream for us. So I think all those things are really scalable down. You know, even for small farmers, we've seen, you know, for example, in the headwaters of the Otter in Devon, small farmers that have been really struggling to make ends meet, you know, now have an ecotourism business, glamping or shepherd's huts or B&B, because people are coming to see beavers. You know, I think there really are, and Rewilding Britain has done an amazing study on this, has shown that even rewilding projects that are 5 years old, have doubled the employment and you know, just exponentially grown opportunities for volunteers and public access.
Okay, one more question that was in the middle there. Have you got the microphone? Yeah.
I've got it here, yeah, hello. We hear an awful lot about the need to increase house building in this country, and I just sort of wonder whether you've got any ideas for a better relationship between increased ecosystems and rewilding or wilding and this sort of house building frenzy.
God, it is really difficult, and I mean we're fighting a building development, 3,500 houses on the border of NEP, right in the middle of our new kind of green corridor. We've got this amazing project called Wheel to Waves, where we've got 100 miles of green corridor, farmers, landowners, gardeners, all joining to make this green corridor down from NEP to the sea, down our 3 river catchments. And this is, you know, planned development is slap bang in the middle of it. It's nowhere near a railway station, no infrastructure. It's a green site. And that's what developers prefer, because there's fewer people to object. It's easier to build on, they make more money from it. We've got to go look at, you know, brownfield sites. We've got to look at, you know, where there is existing infrastructure, office space, you know, the kind of things that developers don't want to do because it's expensive. So, you know, we have to have government direction where they're actually going to help developers develop the places which may be tricky or complex, but actually where it makes more sense to have more housing. We need the housing, but, you know, we've got to have a living landscape again too. So we've got to think very intelligently about where we put the houses. Yeah, it is a very, very tricky one.
Well, I could go on all day, but I've absolutely loved listening to you and all the stories, and as usual have learnt, you know, even more than what I had before. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you everyone for coming to listen. Give Isabella a